Representative Erin Bingham sits on the Commerce and Human Resources Committee, the Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee, and the State Affairs Committee. She joins us this week to talk about her major takeaways from the legislative session and her plans for the upcoming election. Thank you so much, Representative Bingham, for joining us here today. And we're really grateful that we can have you here on our show. So, now that the legislative session has ended, what would you say the general atmosphere was like for the entirety of the session, and especially towards the end?
Yeah, so last year in the legislative session, we gave 453 million in tax cuts. And then after the session last year, in July, the one big beautiful bill was passed. So when we came into the session, that was kind of looming. Were we going to conform to the big beautiful bill, the one big beautiful bill? And Idaho took a so we did again. But what that resulted in is that we gave $608 million in tax cuts. So that meant that our revenue was less than what we had anticipated. And so with that came adjustments that needed to be made. And so that came of cutting spending in different areas. So I would say that that was definitely the biggest issue, was coming in and trying to figure out how to cut and where to cut. What ended up happening is they did 4% cuts for the last fiscal year and 5% cuts for the fiscal year moving forward. I am not an advocate of cutting across the board. I don't feel like that's very precise. I don't think that makes for smart cuts. It's much better to have committees and to go line by line and look at places where we can have efficiencies, economies of scale, and and I feel like that's a much better way to go through and do cutting, rather than just the flat across the board cuts for every agency.
And
And
with
so
the
I
oh, sorry, go for it. Keep going.
no, I would say we were voting on budgets clear till the end of the session. And so coming into it, we were kind of, I was not on JFAC, which is the Joint Finance and Appropriation Committee, which consists of 10 members from the House and the Senate. And they're the ones who put the budgets together, and then they come forward to the floor and they're voted on by the entire body. And so we were still voting on budgets clear until the end. But in the beginning of the session, we were looking at, where are the cuts going to come from? Are we going to conform to the one big beautiful bill? And yeah, so we were still voting on budgets clear up until the last day.
And I know that you talked a lot about the budgets and that being really a major focus with this legislative session. But what would you say were some of your other focuses? What were some of your other main accomplishments or things that you were proud of that you worked on this session?
I would say the most fulfilling legislation that I worked on didn't even pass. And so it's just something that I will continue to work on. And it was moving kratom. I'm not sure if you're familiar with kratom, but it was moving kratom to a Schedule One drug, and it ended up getting stalled in the Health and Welfare Committee and didn't make it to the floor, and then also didn't make it to the Senate. But in Bonneville County, we've had 6 deaths in 18 months from overdose of kratom. And so it was trying to bring awareness as to the addictive nature and dangerousness of kratom. And so I think that was probably some of the most fulfilling things that I did. We had several hearings, and there was a lot of testimony given. And so personally, I was able to coordinate with local community members who had been affected. I spoke with a lot with our Sheriff Hulse, our coroner, Shante Sanchez, with doctors in the community, with family members who had lost loved ones due to kratom overdose. And that was probably one of the most satisfying things that I did. I was sad that we weren't able to get something done this legislative session, but during the off session, I'm continuing to work on it too, and we will bring it back next year.
So I know you talked a lot about the bill that you've introduced to regulate and change the scheduling of the new drug kratom, but can you give a little bit more of a description of what it is and what kind of inspired that bill?
Yeah. So kratom comes from a plant, and when it dries, it has a substance that's called 7-OH in it. And you can take that in its natural form, but typically what happens is manufacturers extract that 7-OH, or they also can uh, synthetically produce the 7-OH, and they concentrate it into pill form or into drinks or things like that. It works on the new opioid receptors, and so it's very similar in nature to opioids. And we have an opioid epidemic in our country, and this is, works. Kratom works very similar to other opioids as far as what it does and the addictive nature. And then also, as you build a tolerance, then people begin to take more, and people can overdose and die from it.
And aside
And
from,
so,
oh,
yeah,
sorry,
so
keep going.
sorry. So my bill, the bill that I worked on was moving kratom, mitragynine, which is the term for it, mitragynine, to a Schedule 1 substance, similar to things like heroin, cocaine, and marijuana.
And aside from kind of the budget and your main legislative priorities, are there any maybe bigger picture lessons or other takeaways that you've had specifically from this session that you want to take away and kind of learn from?
As a new legislator, I was actually appointed 2 days before the session began, so I didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare. So I kind of went in not knowing what to expect, which I guess sometimes that's good and that's bad. But I learned a lot. A lot of it is just learning about the process, learning about, there's the different priority. I mean, there's the different duties of federal government, state government, local government, and understanding what those different separations of power, or the separations of obligations. And so it's looking at bills and saying, okay, from a state perspective, what are the things that the state should be dealing with, and what things are left to the federal government, and what things need to be left to the local government. And sometimes each of those branches of, or those areas of government, try to encroach upon others. So like the federal government does not, in the state of Idaho, we don't like when the federal government tells us what to do. And I found that often at the state level, sometimes we wanted to tell local government what to do. And I think it's important to have those separations, that separation, and to not encroach upon other things that are the duty or the obligation of the individual entities within our country.
And I know that you talked about how you were appointed and you've learned a lot from this legislative session, but what would you say? So you recently filed for reelection and are running for reelection. What would you say you're planning on campaigning on, and what do you hope your message will be to your constituents with that upcoming election and the primary being just a little bit over 6 weeks away?
I would say my key priorities are, right now we have an affordability issue. And I'm sure as a young student, you're seeing that and you're wondering, how am I ever going to afford to buy a house? Or, what kind of a career am I going into? What does that pay? What does that look like for my family? And I think that that's the same thing a lot of families and individuals are experiencing in the state of Idaho. Is housing prices have gone up, the price of healthcare has gone up, everything has gone up. And so we're looking at ways that we can help with affordability. So there was a couple bills that I sponsored this session. Two were in the housing realm, and one was within healthcare. And it's just looking at simple ways that we can help to bring down those costs. I would say another area of of interest for me is education. I'm a product of public education, and I have been blessed by education in my life. And I think education is a great priority, one that the church really, really focuses on and makes a priority. And so I'm a product of that. I graduated from Rick's College back in 1998, and then my husband and I got married. We actually met at Rick's, and then we spent the next 8 years pursuing education. Um, and so my life has been blessed. I came from a family that neither one of my parents graduated from college, but I wanted that for myself, and so I left to Rexburg in 1996, and with the hopes and dreams of making something of myself. And so I think education is important. Both we look at education and what does that look like in our state. We have lots of different educational opportunities. We have public schools, charter schools, private schools, homeschooling. What does that look like? How do we have the tide raise? Because when the tide raises, all boats rise. And so we look at how do we better educate our students, and then um, what does education look like for individuals after high school, and whether it's our community college. So in Bonneville County, we have the College of Eastern Idaho, which is fairly new, and they've been growing rapidly, and some of these budget cuts have affected College of Eastern Idaho. They had to reduce enrollment in 3 programs because they lost 8 faculty members. um, and so I think, to me, education is definitely one of my priorities. I think that's how we that's how we improve ourselves. That's how um, we make our lives better, as far as being able to make a living and to be able to raise our families. And so education, I would say, is also definitely important to me. Also in our area, we agriculture is really important. It's the number one economic driver in our state, or specifically in this area. And so part of agriculture, the importance of part of agriculture is the importance of water, and that has become a big topic of discussion the last couple years. And so we need to look at ways where we can store more water, make sure that we have the water that's needed for our farmers, for crops to grow. We're also growing a lot, and so we need to look at how we manage that water and that precious resource for our area. And so I would say those are some of the top things that are my focus.
Perfect. And thank you so much, Representative Bingham, for joining us here today. I just have one more question for you. I know we've talked about a
Yeah.
lot of the legislative session and your plans for the election, but what would you say is the best way for your constituents or the everyday citizen to be involved in the legislative process and involved in the upcoming election process?
I think something that's important is just be involved in your communities. Uh, is just to know what's going on. Talk to your senators and your representatives in your area. If you have questions about how they voted on a particular bill, or reach out to them, you can email me at ebingham@house.idaho.gov, and I try to be responsive to those emails. I do get a lot of emails, so if I don't reply back, just maybe shoot me another one, but I try to be responsive to those. But I think it's being involved with the leaders who are elected. I think it's important to know what the issues are, and to stay just, and more so, just to be involved in your communities. I think that that's where it all starts. And that's really my impetus for why I um, put my name forward to replace when Representative Wendy Horman, when she left to the Trump administration. For me, it all started with service. I have 4 children, and I spent a lot of years and a lot of hours working in the classroom, being the PTO president, the room mom, whatever my kids were involved in, I was involved in, being the team mom, or, being on the boards for different clubs and things that they were on. And so I think it's just being involved in your community and serving where you stand. And that looks different at different phases in our lives and different things. But I think as you're involved in the community, you come to understand what the issues are, the things that are important, and it's all a way that we make where we live a great place to be.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much, Representative Bingham. We're glad that you could come on the show.